Today, we become legends.
What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here then be sure to subscribe for all my content coming soon. Today we're going to be doing another tier list. And for this one, it's going to be the most balanced gods in Smite. So the high tiers in this one are going to be historically most balanced. I'm not talking about right now, obviously. That would just be kind of like a meta tier list in a way. And I'm talking about the entire god's history in Smite here. So obviously, some gods that have released more recently is going to be just how they perform right now, basically. But a lot of the older gods that have been in the game for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, even 9 years, some of them at this point since Smite released in 2012. You know, I'm going to be considering that whole history in the game. So even if a god's broken right now, it might have been like pretty balanced in the history of the game. And when I say the word balance, I mean overpowered and underpowered. You know, a god can be horrendously underpowered and not be balanced, and a god can also be horrendously overpowered and not be balanced. You know, you want to find a middle ground with that. And let's just jump in with Achilles. So Achilles is a fairly unbalanced god, especially at his release date. You know, he's obviously been brought to heal a little more in the more recent years of Smite. He's still, I would say, a little bit unbalanced, but Achilles is like usually pretty fine in the current state of Smite. But his release, he was very overpowered, so I'm going to drop him in like maybe B tier? I mean, you could argue he could be C tier as well because his release was very horrendous and he's not been in the game too long. I think we'll leave him in C for now. And also, there's probably going to be a lot of gods down in C and D and stuff just because Smite always releases their gods unbalanced. You know, there's going to be very few gods at the top end of this tier list, honestly. Agni, however, is going to be an S+ god. Agni, to me, always just feels like pretty balanced. The most Agni ever gets is like, you know, pretty strong or a little bit weak. He never gets like completely dominating the meta, but he's never weak either. You know, you can always make an Agni work, and I feel like it's been like that for the entire history of Agni and Smite, to be honest. So yeah, he's going to be one of the few prize characters up here that actually gets a high tier placement here. AMC is like reasonably balanced, but he has had times where like he's popped off or times where he's been extremely weak. You know, it's whether it should be B or C. You know, AMC, he's had a lot of periods where he's been super weak, and he's also had a lot of periods where he completely pops off. So maybe C tier is probably pretty fine for him, but we'll see. We might move some people around once I realize how many are going to be in these bottom tiers, because it's probably going to be a lot. Apuash, D tier, obvious D tier placement. You know, Apuash at release was absolutely ridiculously stupid. Apuash during Dirty Bubble meta, where you would build full defense and Magi's Blessing on mages, he was really OP there as well. And then basically for the rest of his existence, he's been extremely underpowered. So I think Apuash is probably one of the least balanced gods in Smite history. We have Amaterasu. I'll give her a B, somewhere around the middle. Amaterasu has been pretty strong a lot of times, and she's never really that weak. It's more so like she's just a little bit too strong a lot of the time. And so I think I'll give her a B tier placement for that. Anher, pretty balanced in general. I would say I'll give Anher like an A tier placement. Anher does have times where he completely pops off, but in general he's just like a quite solid, fairly balanced god. Anubis, you know, probably D tier. Arguably could be C tier, but probably D tier. You know, very unbalanced god, extremely weak in the hands of people that don't really know what they're doing, and also extremely strong against people that don't know what they're doing in a way. So like he's extremely hard to balance, and it's understandable that he's a D tier character, and that's kind of fine. You know, people play Anubis for like the funsies. You don't expect to play super competitively with Anubis a lot of the time. It's just like arena and stuff like that. We have Ao Kuang, probably D tier. It's D tier or C tier for Ao Kuang. Maybe he's not quite as bad as these two. Definitely not as bad as Apuash anyway. But with Ao Kuang, it's often like Ao Kuang absolutely is dominating, or you never see him and he falls off the map. So like he is definitely quite an unbalanced god. He could be a D tier. Aphrodite, D tier again. Similar to Apuash, she's either complete garbage or she's really, really broken. We had a meta recently where Aphrodite became super broken and everyone hated it. And then we've she's fallen off a little bit now. To be fair, right now she's like fairly balanced, I would say. But in the past, she's been either extremely weak or extremely strong. Definitely deserves D tier. And I'm going to try and go faster through some of these now that you guys get the idea of the tier list, because we do have a lot of gods to place. You know, there's over 100 gods in Smite nowadays. So like when I do tier lists with every single god, I sometimes separate them into classes, and it's for this reason, because the video is going to get very long. So I will stop rambling and start placing some gods. So Apollo, pretty unbalanced, to be honest. Probably a C tier. He's had a lot of times where he's completely broken the game in the ADC role. Arachne, D tier, completely broken against like a lot of new players, and just honestly strong in general in a lot of ranks, but also like has a lot of character flaws that make her just either very weak or very strong depending on who you're playing against in the current meta. Ares, actually fairly balanced. I do think Ares is one of the more balanced gods in the game. He's always had like his toolkit. He does what he does and he does it well, but he doesn't do anything completely insane. He never really breaks the meta or anything. I honestly think I would give Ares an S. The only thing in general is that like sometimes he can be a bit too strong and oppressive when like early game support metas are quite dominant. Artemis, terrible. You know, Artemis is one of those gods where she was either incredibly overpowered, like the few times in history where she has been, like when they buffed the bow, or like very recently with the Silver Branch bow. But in general, Artemis is very weak, so definitely a D tier placement there. Artio, I'll give C to Artio simply because recently she seemed a lot more balanced, but like her release was completely ridiculous and then she fell off the map for a while, but I think she's coming back into it a little bit more now. Athena, very balanced. Much like Ares, she kind of has her toolkit and she does what she does, but it doesn't completely break the game. You know, she has a very powerful AoE taunt CC, which is the main reason to play her alongside her ultimate, which very strong as well, but she's never super game breaking. You could argue she should come down to A because she's been a bit too dominant in some metas. You know, a lot of like early Smite was dominated by Athena, so maybe she should drop down a tier, but she was never completely breaking the game, I wouldn't say. Awilix, definitely one of the more balanced gods. I think this one could even be an S+. You know, Awilix is extremely strong in the right hands and in the right situation, but she's never been like unplayable or like super duper strong or anything like that, so I think I'll put her in the S+ here. She's probably one of the few ones that does deserve it. Baba Yaga, like C tier probably. I don't think she's warranted of D because she hasn't been out that long, but her release was obviously incredibly underpowered. One of the worst releases we've seen since like Raven and Kabrakan and those kind of releases. But now, more recently, she's actually come into the meta quite a bit and is pretty strong. She's generally like too strong or too weak is what I've seen from Baba Yaga. Bacchus, probably up here with Ares, one of those aggressive supports that when the meta favors him, he can seem dominant, you know, with how much damage he does and things. But honestly, Bacchus never really gets super unbalanced. If anything, he's a little unbalanced to the downside more often than the upside. Bacchusura, D tier god. He thrives in farm metas, just absolutely dominates when he can just like farm everything in the jungle, invade metas and stuff like that. Very unhealthy for the game, in my opinion, this character. Definitely a D tier placement. Baron Samedi. Once again, I'll give Baron Samedi like maybe a B because his release was horrendous, don't get me wrong, but they did balance change him fairly quickly and he's been like balanced and playable for the entire rest of his release, which is why I'm putting him like slightly higher up. Bastet, gotta be a D tier, right? Bastet's either broken or unplayable. You know, after her rework, she's been unplayable for so long, and even before her rework, she was completely unplayable. This is probably one of the lowest placements on the tier list actually in general. But of course, there have been Bastet metas in the past where she absolutely dominated as well. She's just like unbalanced to both sides really. Bellona, I think I have to give her like a C tier. You could potentially argue her up to a B tier, but I feel like Amaterasu has been more balanced than Bellona, because like Bellona's release was arguably the second strongest release in the game, probably is the second strongest release we've ever seen after release Guan Yu. And she dominated for a long ass time, and the only reason I want to move her up from C to D is that she's been very balanced in recent years. Maybe like slightly underpowered for sometimes, slightly overpowered for others, but she's been around the balance point for about 2 or 3 years now. It's just it took a lot to get her there, so I am going to put her still fairly far down. Kabrakan, D tier. Honestly, that completely dominates with like tremors and solo and burst damage out of jungle. Not really a viable support. And this release was obviously complete garbage. Probably second weakest release we've ever seen compared to Raven. Camazotz, D tier. Camazotz, I feel like maybe we'll give him C tier, but he's either dominant or you never see him. You know, there was that spurt in solo where he became extremely popular as a solo lane, absolutely dominating, and then he just fell off the map. Like, this god doesn't feel extremely balanced to me. Cerberus, very balanced, honestly. He's usually slightly overpowered or slightly underpowered. He never absolutely pops off destroying people. Very solid, consistent god. Kurnanos, similar thing, honestly. But simply because of Kurnanos' release, we'll drag him down to an A, but it was kind of like Baron in that like his release got under control very quickly and he's been a balanced god ever since, so I don't mind placing him a little higher up. We should maybe put him with Baron since they're a similar situation. Chak, gotta be like an A tier placement for Chak. It could even be S. Chak's never completely bodying people, but he's always there in the background. You know, he's an aggressive lane dominator. If you can make him work, he definitely does very well. He's never been super unplayable, but he's also never broken the meta. In fact, I think he does deserve an S. You could even argue Chak should be S+, which I've talked myself into it, man. I've talked myself into it. I think Chak's an S+ for balance, honestly. Chang'e, D or C, right? Is she worse than Afro? You know, because they're both healers, I like to compare them that way. She's probably not worse than Afro, but Chang'e in general, she either completely dominates or she's just never seen. You know, she's had some spurts in solo. She had that one thing in jungle, like whenever it was season 5 or something, where Chang'e jungle absolutely bodied the meta for a little while, and then she fell off the map. Fairly unbalanced god there. Chernobog's okay. He was a little overpowered at release for me, but he definitely got toned down in a reasonable amount of time, similar to these other two that we have in this tier. Chiron, pretty fair. Chiron's release was actually very balanced. I haven't really had any problem with Chiron. He was a little underpowered for a while, and then they made some buffs to him where like his one applies mark and a few other things like that. Definitely a fair god. Kronos, yeah, I think we have to go with C tier for Kronos. He's kind of like similar to a lot of the other magical ADCs in that he sees play in very specific metas and dominates and then falls off for a while. We have Cthulhu, probably like B. Once again, because its release was completely ridiculous, but it was toned down in a fairly reasonable amount of time, similar to Baron, and now I think Cthulhu is completely fine for the game, if not like a little too strong. Cuchulainn, A or S. Since we have less A's because I'm teetering on it, we'll put him in A, but yeah, Cuchulainn, a little bit overpowered on release, probably more than a little bit overpowered, but they did get it in line very quickly, and he's been a fun and healthy god for the game ever since, and he released quite a while ago, so I'm pretty impressed with Cuchulainn's performance overall in terms of balance. Cupid, D or C, we'll put him in C for now. I want D to be the real, like, depths of despair, like, these gods are just, like, so unbalanceable, like, I would want to rework a lot of these gods down here, whereas, like, C is just, like, they're okay, but they're often not balanced and only see play in certain metas, much like Cupid, you know. He has his pops into the meta, but he's never really dominant for a long time. By which point he falls off and then you don't see him for, like, another 6 months and then he dominates the meta again, so definitely a worthy C tier placement, I think. Daji is similar, but not to that extent. Daji, like, right now is pretty balanced, but she has had metas where she's dominated. Her release was absolutely horrendous. Thinking about her release, I think I do drop it down to C tier. It means I'm going to have to zoom out the chart here, but I think Daji's release probably does warrant her being down here. You know, it was definitely top 5 weakest releases of all time. Daji release was horrible. I have a video on it on my channel if you want to dive more into that. I do with a lot of these gods, actually. A lot of the ones that have had reworks or, like, major changes. I've covered a release history god episode on them. We have Danzaburo, probably a C tier as well. Very overpowered release, but then seems to have fallen off the map for me. I think he's still strong, like still overpowered, but people just kind of like stop playing him, I guess. So yeah, C tier. Discordia, pretty fair. She definitely has metas where she dominates and metas where she's not amazing, but in general, I think Discordia is fairly balanced. Erlang Shen, gotta be like a D tier, I think. As much as I love the gods, like, the unbalance with Erlang Shen is systemic, you know. He has way too much damage within his kit and works way more as an assassin than a warrior. That you should not have warrior-based stats and do the amount of damage that he does. There's like a flaw in him, even though I love the character, I can admit that. And also his release was just absolutely, you know, one of the most overpowered releases we've seen, probably top 10, you know. His 2 used to cripple you as well as root you so you couldn't get out. It was like you got hit by Scylla 1. He did way more damage. He had haste on his 3 or haste on his 1. I think it was changed at one point. Just a ridiculous release. Probably does deserve to be in D tier, even though I love the god to bits. Fafnir. So probably like an A for Fafnir. He does have metas where he like pops off, but in general, fairly balanced god. I think he popped off fairly recently. Fafnir, like, kind of had a big spurt in the meta. We have Fenrir, C tier. You know, Fenrir, like, generally just, like, he's such an early game, like, body kind of god that, like, if there's aggressive support metas or very aggressive jungle metas, like invades, he thrives in that. But in general, he kind of, like, falls off if that's not the meta. He's also been, like, one of the weakest gods in the game many times. And his release was also very unbalanced because Brutalize could crit. And yeah, that led to a lot of like one-shot brutalizers, so generally quite an unbalanced god. Could even be D tier, which I think I might do. Freya's another D tier one. She's either completely overpowered or like unplayable. That's just kind of like magical ADCs in general sometimes. You know, you have metas where magical ADCs are strong, they kind of come in waves, but Freya is like the most egregious in my opinion. You know, a god doesn't get reworked 3 times and still be unplayable and, you know, get a high placement on this list. This is probably like one of the lowest gods on the list for sure. Ganesha has to be an S+, right? I've never had any balance problems with Ganesha at all. He released balanced, and I don't think they've changed him too much, maybe a few slight buffs, and he's been completely fine, you know, just to keep up with power creep and stuff like that. Ganesha, I've never had a problem with balance-wise. Geb, we'll put him in like A, probably along with Fafnir. His release was very overpowered, but since then, he's been in the game a long time, and he's been pretty fair. You know, he's had metas where he's strong, he's had metas where he's not, but I think he's been pretty fair. Guan Yu we have to put in D tier simply because of his release, you know. Release Guan Yu, most overpowered god by a long way that we've ever seen in the game. It has to be down here, even though, like, for a lot of his, like, post-rework in the game, he has been quite strong. Hachiman, again, I feel Hachiman's fairly balanced, somewhere up here with Chiron, where, like, he released, he was fairly balanced, if not a little overpowered, and I've not really heard too much from him in terms of complaints. Hades, D tier. Hades either bodies or feeds. Very inconsistent god. Generally very underpowered, but can have metas where he absolutely dominates. Hebo, a similar thing, but to a lesser extent. We'll put him in the C tier. You know, there's Hebo metas where he's like absolutely going ham and one-shotting people, and then there's metas where you can't physically play Hebo, especially if like Fenrir's in or something. Heimdallr, we'll put him in... I want to put him in B. I want to be kind to Heimdallr because his release was absolutely horrendous, but they got him in tone fairly quickly, and I've actually not had a real big problem with him in the game since then. I've actually kind of liked what they've done with him, and I like the character design, so I will bump him up one placement, but you could definitely argue that Heimdallr should be C along with Kurnos. Hell, probably like C tier. Hell's either like dominating the meta, like healers are like magical ADCs as well. They kind of come in waves, you know, it's a healer meta or it's not, but also like Hell in general is just a bit unplayable or overpowered in general, so like we'll leave her in C. Hera, pretty fair. We'll maybe do B because she has had some metas where she's absolutely dominated, but in general, I've been pretty fine with Hera's balance. Hercules, probably like C tier. Again, I love this character, but he's been way too overpowered in way too many metas. From solo, from support, sometimes even from jungle in the occasional meta. Herc's been way too strong for most of his release. He deserves a C tier placement. Some people will probably even put him in D if they were salty. Horus, S+. Release balance, never had a complaint with Horus. Takes a lot of skill to play. I love the god, even though I don't play him. Definitely very good. Hou Yi, we'll put him B. Like Handelier, his release was actually the opposite. He was incredibly underpowered at release to the point where he was almost unplayable, but they fixed him reasonably quickly, like within half a season or so, I believe it was, and then he's been like completely fine ever since, never had a problem with the balance. Also, there's a house alarm going off on my street. I'm sorry if you can hear that. Hunbats. Hunbats is probably like a pretty balanced god, I would say. There's been metas where Hunbats dominates, but in general, he's been there, you know, is always ever present as like something that is going to be pretty powerful, but then he's also not been like super overpowered either. Like the ult keeps him relevant, but he's never completely dominating, I feel like. Eset, gotta be like a C tier. She was unplayable for a long ass time, but then she was also completely dominant back in like season 1 and 2 when you had like power potion level 1 metas with the mid jungle and stuff like that. You know, Eset was very dominant for a long time back then. Under her old name, of course. Izanami, like C tier, either broken or completely just like unplayable. That's basically Izanami in a nutshell. Janus, either C or B. I think I'll give him a B because I'm being generous to him. But then again, his release probably pulls it down to a C because Janus' release was one of the weakest we've ever seen. Probably the weakest ultimate we've ever seen in the game was on release Janus, actually. Jingwei, I'll give her a B. She's very consistent, almost never like drops off or goes completely ham, but very consistent in the meta. Always a strong presence. If anything, my only complaint with Jingwei is that she's always been a little too strong and should have been a little weaker. Jormungandr, like C, he was released completely overpowered and then fell off the map for a long ass time. He's kind of come back into a little more of a balance point, but probably not enough to move up to a B. Kali, C. Kali either destroys or feeds. Could arguably be D. Khepri, I'll give him an honest B. His release was very overpowered, but since then they've toned him down and he's been pretty fine. King Arthur has to be a D, right? We all know why King Arthur's a D. Kukulkan, probably like a B. He has his like spurts in the meta, but he's always like there. You can always play Kukulkan realistically, but he does have some metas where he like kind of comes out and dominates, which is why he's not like higher up the tier list. We have Kumbhakana, so an overpowered release for sure, but not completely ridiculously overpowered, so I'll give him a B, because the rest of his existence in Smite has just been pretty fine in my opinion. You know, Kumba's always there. You can play him always, but he's never like completely dominant. Kuzunbo, once again, I'll be generous and give him a B, even though he was probably the weakest release of all time, arguably, debatably, with like Raven and Kabrakan as well, but they've made him into such a good character now that I have a lot of respect for Kuzunbo, and I think he's quite balanced in his current spot. Loki, obviously, needed many reworks, but I guess it wasn't really for balance concerns, so maybe I'll move him up to C, but he does definitely have balance concerns in that he was very underpowered for a very long time. But the move up to C is mostly because after his rework, I've actually found him fairly balanced and reasonable to play against in general, so like I'm going to move him up one tier for that. Medusa, should I be generous and give her a B? I think I will since I did for Kuzumbo, but once again, they're the opposite. Medusa's release was ridiculous, like absolutely insane, one of the strongest ADCs we've ever seen, but since then she's fallen into a very nice role that I think she's pretty relevant in a lot of metas, but not like completely dominating. You could argue she should be C because she was one of the worst gods in the game for a while, but I don't think she belongs with some of these ones down in C realistically, like Release Bologna and stuff like that. We have Mercury. I think Mercury's generally quite balanced. You can always play Mercury, you know, the crits always hit hard, but there's counters to him in the game, and he's not like completely breaking the game in many metas. Obviously in the Golden Blade meta, like maybe he deserves A purely because of the Golden Blade meta and the fact that he ran that shit for so long before they made Golden Blade not proc on his one. We have Merlin. I'll give him a B, another generous B, in that his release was absolutely ridiculous and it did take him a while, but like, I think Merlin's been fairly balanced for quite a while in the game now. We have Mulan, probably I'll give her a C, whatever. Her release was very underpowered, she needed some buffs and some tweaks and stuff like that, but I think she's settled into a very nice spot where she's fairly balanced. You could even say she's up here, you know, comparative to like Merlin and Kuzumbo and Medusa and stuff like that. We have Neith. Honestly, Neith is fairly balanced, I have to say. There's been metas where she pops off when ability hunters have been like super strong and stuff like that, but kind of like Mercury, you know, she's kind of ever present. You can usually just play Neith, even though she's needed some quality of life buffs over the years because she's been in the game since 2012. Nemesis, Should I give Nem a B? I probably shouldn't. The only reason Nem is C is because of her release. She's been balanced for a long time, actually, but her release was so egregious that I think she deserves to be down in the C tier. Kind of like Bellona. You know, Bellona's been balanced for a while now, but her release was absolutely insane. Neja, pretty balanced god. Had some janky stuff originally, his original release, but it was fixed, you know, before Smite even came out of beta, so I'm pretty okay with it. I think we'll put him in an A tier. Nike, gotta be a D. Nike's either unplayable or completely explodes and dominates the meta. This god is, like, very volatile. Nox, kind of the same thing, but to a lesser extent, we'll put her in C. Nuwa's been fairly consistent. Obviously, she's had a rework, which shows, like, some problems, but it could be more design problems than balance problems. I feel like Nuwa's been fairly consistently balanced. Odin is got to be like a D tier, right? Odin's just, like, absolutely dominates or becomes completely irrelevant and falls off the map for, like, a year. I'll give Olorun a B. He's had his ups and downs. He's been overpowered, he's been underpowered, but in general, he's been like a fairly balanced god, I would say. Osiris, kind of a similar thing. There's been times when Osiris absolutely dominates, which you could maybe argue he should get down to C, but I think in general, Osiris has been fairly balanced for most of his history, but he has also been unbalanced to the downside, to be completely honest. There's been times where Osiris has been unplayable, so maybe he should be down in the C tier, actually. We have Pele, ridiculously overpowered release, but was brought to heal very quickly. Persephone, obvious D tier, everyone knows why. Poseidon, I'll give him like an A, I think. Poseidon's been pretty balanced. He's a little reliant on the ultimate, but it does always make an impact in fights, which is why he's probably like usually relevant. Raijin, probably like a C. Raijin had to have so many changes. A lot of them were balance related. His ult was incredibly overpowered at release and things like that. Rama has his ups and downs, but in general is a fairly balanced god, I feel like. So he's playing a lot of metas, but there are some where he completely dominates. You know, recently with the bows, Rama was very strong. We have Ra. Ra's pretty balanced, I would say. Healing and damage is like a nice combination that keeps him relevant in most metas, especially because he's received some quality of life buffs regarding his age and stuff like that. Ratatoska, it's got to be a D. Ratatoska release was probably top 3 most overpowered of all time, and then he even like had to have like many changes after that. Raven, we'll give him like a C. The only reason I can't bump Raven up to a B, even though he's been balanced for a long time, is that his release was just so horrendous. Weak, by the way. Raven release was incredibly weak. Scylla's okay. Probably doesn't deserve an A. She's had like some times where she's been way too strong and sometimes where she falls off a bit, but Serket, probably like a C or a D. Serket's very volatile. She relies a lot on the meta. Sometimes he's playing support and also her jungle, of course. Set, probably a C as well, I would say. You know, Set at release, people thought he was like underpowered or like maybe just balanced, and then it took a while for people to really unlock Set and discover how truly overpowered he was, and he broke the meta for quite a long time. Could arguably even be D. Skadi, like C. Sobek. Sobek's been pretty consistent, I would say. I'd give him like an S, honestly. He doesn't quite deserve an S+, because there have been some metas where like Sobek solo and Sobek support are both dominating, and like you're fighting over Sobek for roles and stuff like that, which maybe should be A, to be completely honest with you, regarding that. Sol, one of the most overpowered releases in history, and also magical ADC. She tends to fluctuate with the meta a lot. I'll give her a C, but you could arguably go down to D, to be honest, because like she's on a level of like Rat in terms of how overpowered her release was. Sun Wukong, probably an S+, honestly. Wukong always feels like he's pretty balanced. There's sometimes where he's like overpowered, but he's never really underpowered, you know. You can always kind of play a Wukong and never really feel too bad about it. I feel like in general, in most metas, he's quite balanced. Susanoo, like a C. Susanoo's completely like fallen off of the map in recent times, but there have been like, you know, his release and things like that, where periods where he's been absolutely dominant. Sylvanas, probably a C as well. You know, his release was one of the most overpowered we've seen, one of the most overpowered Guardians, that's for sure. And then he kind of like fell off the map quite a bit, but he's definitely returned to balance a little bit more now, but probably not enough to warrant a B given his release. Terra, definitely had times when she was overpowered, but she's pretty fine. Thanatos is like totally fine. I've never really had a problem with Thanatos' balance. Like, yeah, he does a lot of damage, but I think he has definitely like checking factors. Morrigan's a difficult one to place, right? In theory, Morrigan's always unbalanced because of the ridiculous stuff you can do with her. So maybe I will put her like further down here or something. Thor, in general, quite balanced, but has had his ups and downs. There was a time for a while, for like 2 seasons, where he was like almost unplayable, and then they reworked him partially, and he became very strong for a while. But I think in general, like throughout his whole history in Smite, because he's been in the game a long time, he's like been pretty balanced. Thoth, pretty balanced right now, but had problems at release for sure. Tyr, pretty fine, but like has had some abuse cases, like the speedy Tyr builds and stuff like that. Ula, probably a C. Ula's very strong at times, completely breaks the meta. For mana, same thing, to be honest. Maybe you could argue for mana's a B, similar to Tyr. Vulcan's pretty balanced. I don't really have a problem with Vulcan's balance in most metas. Probably give him an S. Xbalanque, Xbalanque is debatable. He's had a lot of changes where like it's completely knocked him off the map. Like when his ult was changed, he completely fell off, but before his ult was changed, he was absolutely dominating, so probably like a B. Xing Chen, so released a little too overpowered, but overall he's been pretty good, I would say. I'll give him like an A. Yamoja has to be a C or a D. She's like been overpowered for her entire release, but people don't know how to play her, and so she gets away with it. Yumia's always balanced, I feel like. You can do so strong with Yumiya if like you have walls and stuff like that. If your wall game's on point with Yumiya, you can do so well, but then also like, but then he's never really like super overpowered either. Like Yumiya's never really breaking the meta, but when you do see a good Yumiya player, like you feel pretty good about it. We have Zeus, D tier, obvious reasons. We have Zhonghui, pretty volatile. I feel like there's bursts of Zhonghui where like he goes absolutely ham and then he falls off for a bit, so I'll give him a C. Tsukuyomi, I'll give like a C as well, because like way too overpowered release, arguably still is too overpowered to be completely honest with you. Gilgamesh, obvious D, everyone knows why. Morgana Le Fay, obvious D, everyone knows why. Tiamat, she is overpowered, but she is like balanced by the fact that she like has a lot of skill requirements. But I think I'll still give her like a C. A lot of these recent gods, like it's because they were released overpowered and haven't had like time to be nerfed into balance, but it's just how it is. And so yeah, that's the entire tier list for anyone that cares, just because you can't really see it when I'm like selecting all the gods and things like that. So some of them notable like top ones we have are Agni, Awilix, Chak, Ganesha, Horus, Sun Wukong, Yumiya, and some other ones in S tier there. And then some of the notable like D tier placements, some of the ones I'll pick out here that like are particularly egregious to me is like Freya, Yamoja, Persephone, Gilgamesh, Aphrodite, Apwash, Morgan Le Fay, but I hope she'll get nerfed into balance and be pretty okay. Bakasura, big problem as well. There's a lot of like big problem characters down here, obviously, because they're the most unbalanced in the game. They're the hardest to balance in theory. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this tier list. I know it was a little bit of an out there one, but I feel like it's interesting to talk about how balanceable gods are and how balanced they've been throughout the history, and maybe like you could learn something from some of the top gods and the bottom gods and try and get more towards the middle. But yeah, that's it for today's video. I will catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.